He worked at the Soviet Foreign Ministry, wore expensive suits, drove a black Volga, and smiled politely in the hallways. But at night, he talked to his reflection, hid microfilm in batteries, and memorized phrases meant only for the moment everything collapsed. He wanted to be a millionaire, fell in love with a woman who never existed, and turned down promotions to access top-secret files. He didn't know that every step was being recorded, every glance tracked, and his death was already part of someone else's plan. When they caught him, he looked calm, but just hours later, he picked up the pen and swallowed something that kills in 12 seconds. Why? Fear? Love? Or an order? And that is not even the darkest part of this story. Because the real ending didn't begin with his death. It began after it. Aleksandr Dmitrievich Ogorodnik appeared to be everything the Soviet system could produce. Born in 1939 in Sevastopol to a naval officer's family, he embodied the ideals of the new socialist man. His academic record at MGIMO sparkled with excellence. His dissertation in economics earned him recognition among his peers. His party membership seemed as natural as breathing. By 1971, at just 32, Ogorodnik had secured a coveted position as secretary at the Soviet embassy in Bogota, Colombia. For most Soviet diplomats, such an assignment represented the pinnacle of career achievement. Foreign postings meant access to Western goods, international experiences, and the kind of prestige that opened doors back home. Yet beneath this polished exterior, small cracks had begun to appear. Colleagues noticed his peculiar relationship with money. He would lend cigarettes to fellow diplomats, then demand payment down to the last kopeck. Even 10 cents mattered to him. This wasn't frugality, it was something deeper, more consuming. His appetite for women proved equally insatiable. Despite arriving in Bogota with his wife, Ogorodnik pursued affairs with a reckless abandon that puzzled his colleagues. He wasn't charming or sophisticated in his approach. He was simply relentless, pursuing any woman who showed the slightest interest. These weren't the traits of a master spy. They were the vulnerabilities of a man whose desires had begun to outweigh his judgment. Bogota, 1974. The city pulsed with the energy of a nation caught between tradition and modernity. At a cultural exhibition, Ogorodnik encountered a woman who would change the trajectory of his life. Her name was Pilar Suarez Barcala, and she worked at the Colombian Institute of Culture. She was beautiful, intelligent, and inexplicably drawn to the Soviet diplomat. Their romance blossomed quickly, documented in photographs and film by observers who remained unseen. But Pilar was not what she seemed. She was a carefully constructed fiction, a creation of the CIA's operational planners. The technique was as old as espionage itself. Intelligence agencies called it a honey trap, but the reality was far more sophisticated than simple seduction. Pilar represented everything Ogorodnik felt he was missing: freedom, passion, and a life unbound by the rigid constraints of Soviet society. Through Pilar, Ogorodnik was introduced to her friends, charming Americans who seemed genuinely interested in his insights into Soviet policy. They spoke of opportunities, of a different kind of life, of rewards that dwarfed his modest diplomatic salary. The proposition, when it finally came, was elegantly simple. Work for the CIA and receive not just money, but an American passport, a prestigious position in the United States, and Pilar herself as a permanent companion. The alternative, implied but never stated directly, involved those photographs and films of their intimate moments. But the Americans needn't have worried about blackmail. Ogorodnik's response was immediate and enthusiastic. The prospect of becoming a millionaire and a citizen of the free world appealed to something fundamental in his character. He agreed without hesitation. Moscow, 1975. Ogorodnik's homecoming should have been a triumph. He had served his country abroad and returned with valuable experience. Instead, he made a decision that would later seem inexplicable. He declined a prestigious position at the Institute of Latin American Studies, which would have offered creative work, foreign travel, and an excellent salary. Instead, he chose the Foreign Ministry's planning department for foreign policy events. The position was routine, bureaucratic, and required him to maintain regular office hours from 9 in the morning. But it offered something the Institute could not: access to classified documents that outlined the fundamental directions of Soviet international policy. These weren't regional analyses or country-specific reports. They were comprehensive strategic documents that touched on Soviet relations with the entire world. For someone in Ogorodnik's position, this access represented a treasure trove of intelligence. His behavior upon returning to Moscow raised eyebrows among those who knew him. He purchased a new Volga sedan in prestigious black, driving it with unusual patterns of movement. He would make sudden turns, unexpected detours through courtyards, and constant checks of his mirrors. To trained observers, these were the movements of someone checking for surveillance. But perhaps most telling was his choice of companionship. Shortly after the passing of his fiancée Olga Serova under mysterious circumstances, Ogorodnik began a relationship with another Olga, this one working in the apparatus of the Supreme Soviet of the Russian Federation. His interest in her work seemed almost professional, as he questioned her about the documents that passed through her hands. The KGB's suspicions about Ogorodnik didn't emerge from a single incident. They built slowly, like water finding cracks in a foundation. The first warning came from ongoing arms limitation talks with the United States. Soviet negotiators began to notice that their American counterparts seemed unusually well informed about Soviet positions, sometimes appearing to know the general outline of Soviet strategies before they were formally presented. The second alarm came from an unexpected source: Karl Kocher, a Czechoslovakian intelligence officer who had successfully infiltrated the CIA. Kocher reported that the Americans had recruited a Soviet embassy employee in Bogota who had returned to Moscow and was now working within the Foreign Ministry. In October 1976, the KGB opened operational file Cayman with a specific objective: neutralize the American agent with the operational codename Trianon. At that point, they knew almost nothing about him except that he existed. The investigation that followed was a masterpiece of counterintelligence work. Lieutenant Colonel Petrukin, the case officer, began by approaching Ogorodnik with a request for informal cooperation with the KGB. The invitation was presented as routine: help keep an eye on the mood among foreign ministry workers, report any unusual conversations or concerning attitudes. Ogorodnik agreed readily, perhaps seeing the cooperation as useful cover for his real activities. But the meetings gave the KGB something invaluable: regular access to observe their suspects' behavior, speech patterns, and reactions to various topics. The KGB's surveillance of Ogorodnik required techniques that pushed the boundaries of their capabilities. They needed to access his apartment without detection, monitor his activities without alerting him, and gather evidence while maintaining the fiction of normalcy. The opportunity came through an ingenious deception. Petrukin invited Ogorodnik to a bathhouse popular with sports enthusiasts, ostensibly to discuss an important assignment. The gathering was carefully staged, with KGB operatives posing as ordinary citizens enjoying a social evening. The goal was simple: obtain impressions of Ogorodnik's apartment keys without him knowing. But even in this relaxed setting, Ogorodnik's paranoia showed. Tables groaned under delicacies, sandwiches with caviar and salmon, and most tempting of all, cold Czech beer in cans, an incredible luxury in 1970s Moscow. Yet Ogorodnik refused to eat or drink anything, claiming he was on a diet. His caution was absolute. He understood that substances could be introduced into food or drink that might loosen his tongue or compromise his judgment. Despite his vigilance, the operatives succeeded in making impressions of his keys. They also discovered something remarkable. Ogorodnik was carrying the equivalent of several months' salary in cash, far more than any legitimate source could explain. When Ogorodnik left Moscow for a Black Sea vacation in May 1977, KGB technicians made their move. They entered his communal apartment room, but the visit yielded almost nothing. Ogorodnik had prepared for this possibility, leaving behind a sophisticated system of tells, books placed in specific positions, threads and hairs positioned to reveal any disturbance. The KGB's response was characteristically thorough. They established a listening post in the apartment directly above Ogorodnik's room, drilling holes through the ceiling to install microphones and a miniature camera. The aperture was barely a millimeter in diameter, invisible to casual observation even if someone knew where to look. From this vantage point, they observed Ogorodnik's daily routines, his conversations with visitors, and his peculiar habit of talking to himself. He would approach the refrigerator and conduct entire conversations with his reflection. "Sasha, will you have some soup?" "No, I don't want any." "How about some vodka?" "No, I don't want that either." On the evening of June 20th, 1977, the surveillance yielded its first concrete evidence. Senior Lieutenant observed Ogorodnik through the hidden camera as he performed what appeared to be a routine maintenance task on a pocket flashlight. He removed the batteries, but from one of them, he extracted 4 small cassettes containing microfilm. The KGB finally had proof. Aleksandr Ogorodnik was indeed the agent codenamed Trianon. The discovery of the microfilm cassettes confirmed what the KGB had suspected, but it also presented a new opportunity. Rather than immediately arresting Ogorodnik, they considered using him to feed disinformation to the Americans. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Allow Trianon to continue operating, but control the information he transmitted. However, events soon forced a change in strategy. On the morning of July 15, 1977, multiple vehicles left the American embassy in Moscow, heading in different directions across the city. This was a classic intelligence maneuver designed to overwhelm surveillance and allow at least one operative to reach their destination undetected. Among the American personnel in those vehicles was someone whose behavior had never attracted KGB attention. Martha Peterson, officially the vice consul, but actually a CIA operative who had been working in Moscow since November 1975. Peterson's cover was nearly perfect. She was known to drink heavily, sometimes to the point of needing assistance from embassy guards. She had been seen sleeping on the steps of the embassy after particularly heavy drinking sessions. Her behavior was so consistently unprofessional that she seemed an unlikely candidate for sensitive intelligence work. Yet on that July evening, it was Peterson who made her way to the Krasnolushsky railway bridge near Luzhniki Stadium for a prearranged meeting with Trianon. To understand how Ogorodnik became Trianon, we must return to that exhibition in Bogota in 1974. The recruitment process had been textbook perfect. After the initial approach through Pilar, American intelligence officers had carefully assessed their potential asset. They found a man whose weaknesses perfectly matched their operational needs. Ogorodnik's love of money, his romantic entanglements, and his desire for a different kind of life. made him an ideal candidate for recruitment. More importantly, his position within the Soviet diplomatic corps offered access to exactly the kind of strategic intelligence the CIA most valued. The Americans didn't just recruit Ogorodnik, they trained him. They taught him to operate concealed cameras, to use coded communications, and to service dead drops. They provided him with sophisticated equipment, including cameras disguised as ordinary objects like cigarette lighters and pens. Most significantly, they gave him something far more sinister: cyanide capsules. The first was ostensibly for Ogorodnik's own use if he faced capture, but subsequent requests suggested a different purpose entirely. The mysterious passing of Olga Serova, Ogorodnik's fiancée, took on new significance in this context. She had fallen ill suddenly and passed away in a hospital within days. At her funeral, Ogorodnik had wept openly, even placing an engagement ring on her finger as she lay in her coffin. But investigators later discovered that Serova's father, a doctor, had requested that no autopsy be performed because his daughter was pregnant. The father's knowledge of the pregnancy came entirely from Ogorodnik himself. The timing of her illness, immediately after she might have discovered Ogorodnik's activities, raised troubling questions. The arrest of Aleksandr Ogorodnik on June 21, 1977, marked the end of one of the most significant espionage cases of the Cold War era. But it also began one of the most unusual deception operations in KGB history. When KGB officers entered Ogorodnik's apartment with a search warrant, they found a man in complete psychological collapse. His legs shook uncontrollably. His hands trembled as he tried to light cigarettes. This robust man, who had successfully operated as a spy for years, was reduced to a quivering shell of himself. Initially, Ogorodnik denied everything, but when the officers produced the microfilm cassettes from his flashlight, his resistance crumbled. He began providing detailed confessions about his recruitment, his training, and his activities in Moscow. The search of his apartment revealed the full scope of his espionage activities: cipher tables, CIA instructions, 2 pistols, and substantial amounts of currency. But the most significant discovery was yet to come. Around 2 a.m., Ogorodnik requested permission to write a statement to the head of the KGB. He began with the formal heading, "To the Committee for State Security of the USSR," then paused, claiming his pen was malfunctioning. He requested a different pen from those available in the room. The officers examined the replacement pen carefully, but found nothing suspicious. They handed it to Ogorodnik, who began writing again. But his behavior was strange. He would rest his hands on the table, then bring them to his cheeks, glancing occasionally at his interrogators. In that moment of distraction, Ogorodnik managed to unscrew the pen and consume its contents. The pen had contained a sophisticated poison capsule, and within moments, Ogorodnik was experiencing the final effects of the same type of poison he had allegedly used on others. The passing of Aleksandr Ogorodnik presented the KGB with both a problem and an opportunity. The Americans were expecting continued contact with their agent. The sudden silence of Trianon would alert them that their operation had been compromised. At a meeting with KGB Chairman Yuri Andropov, Major General Boyarov proposed an audacious solution: keep Trianon alive by having another officer impersonate him. The role would be played by Senior Lieutenant Viktor Pesok, a surveillance specialist who bore a passing resemblance to Ogorodnik. The deception required professional help. Makeup artists from Moscow film studios were recruited to transform Pesok into a convincing double. They adjusted his facial features, changed his hair, and taught him to mimic Ogorodnik's mannerisms and speech patterns. The performance was remarkably successful. Pesok, accompanied by Ogorodnik's girlfriend Olga, drove through Moscow in the distinctive Black Volga. When they staged their first encounter on Leninsky Prospect, Olga's reaction was immediate and visceral. She ran toward the car calling Sasha and broke down in tears when she saw the impersonator. For the Americans watching from a distance, the message was clear. Their agent was alive and operational. The deception operation reached its climax on July 15, 1977, when the CIA scheduled a dead-drop operation at the Krasnolushsky railway bridge. According to intercepted communications, Trianon was to receive money, another poison capsule, and a list of questions about Soviet negotiating positions in the ongoing arms limitation talks. The KGB operation to capture the CIA operative was codenamed Seton II. As Martha Peterson made her way to the bridge at 11:32 p.m., she was unaware that every step was being monitored and photographed. The bridge location was chosen for its isolation. Any unexpected presence would be immediately obvious. Peterson followed operational protocol perfectly, walking to the center of the bridge, then turning and walking back. As she stepped onto the embankment, the KGB signal went out. Contact. The arrest was swift, but not without complications. Peterson proved to be trained in martial arts, managing to kick several KGB operatives before being subdued. Throughout the struggle, she shouted in English that she was a foreign diplomat, apparently hoping that Trianon might hear and avoid the area. Every second of the capture was photographed by Captain Vladimir Skripkin, creating a detailed record of the operation. At the end of the bridge, operatives discovered the dead drop container, disguised as a piece of asphalt. The interrogation of Martha Peterson revealed the extent of the CIA's investment in the Trianon operation. The dead drop had contained substantial sums of money, sophisticated communications equipment, and detailed questions about Soviet strategic planning. Peterson's attempts to claim diplomatic immunity were complicated by the evidence of her intelligence activities. Despite her official status as vice consul, her actions clearly violated the terms of diplomatic service. She was declared persona non grata and expelled from the Soviet Union on July 17, 1977. But for the KGB, Peterson's capture was only the beginning. The Trianon deception operation continued, with Soviet intelligence feeding carefully crafted disinformation to the CIA through the channels Ogorodnik had established. The full impact of the Trianon case on Soviet-American relations may never be completely known. Some documents remain classified, and the participants have taken their secrets to the grave. But the timing of subsequent events suggests that the KGB's deception operation may have been remarkably successful. For years, the SALT II negotiations had proceeded slowly, with each side apparently anticipating the other's moves. The American side had seemed unusually well informed about Soviet positions, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and strategic paralysis. After the Trianon operation concluded, the negotiation dynamic shifted dramatically. On June 18, 1979, just 2 years after Peterson's arrest, General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev and President Jimmy Carter signed the SALT II agreement. The talks that had dragged on for 7 years suddenly reached a successful conclusion. The question remains, how significantly did the KGB's control of American intelligence about Soviet intentions contribute to this diplomatic breakthrough? The story of Aleksandr Ogorodnik offers a window into the human cost of the Cold War's shadow conflicts. He was neither a master spy nor a committed ideologue. He was a man whose personal weaknesses became weapons in the hands of those who understood how to exploit them. His transformation from loyal Soviet citizen to American asset wasn't driven by political conviction or patriotic fervor. It was the result of carefully orchestrated psychological manipulation that appealed to his deepest desires and fears. The Americans who recruited him understood something fundamental: that the most effective intelligence operations don't rely on force or ideology, but on the quiet cultivation of personal motivations. They offered Ogorodnik not just money, but a different identity, a different future, a different version of himself. In the end, Ogorodnik's story is a reminder that in the world of espionage, the most dangerous weapon is often the one that exists within the human heart. The desire for something more, something different, something better can become a vulnerability that skilled operatives can exploit with devastating effectiveness. The files on Trianon remain partially classified, but the lessons of his story continue to echo through the corridors of intelligence agencies around the world. In a game where trust is currency and betrayal is strategy, the human element remains both the most valuable asset and the most dangerous liability.